see. Now, there is some debate, but generally most experts on cannabis agree that it's not addictive in a chemical sense. So here we need to draw a distinction between chemical addiction and behavioral addiction or psychological addiction. Chemical addiction occurs when your body and the biochemistry of your body, you cannot function normally unless the drug is present. So, for instance, somebody who drinks every single day and drinks a lot every single day, if they go a long period of time in between drinks, they'll start shaking. There's a physical or physiological response to the lack of drug being in their system. And so alcohol is chemically addictive. Now, psychological addiction or behavioral addiction, you can become behaviorally addicted to almost anything, including cannabis, yes, but also social media, watching too much TV, food, overeating, take your pick. You can become behaviorally addicted to literally anything. All that's required is you're feeling an inner compulsion psychologically to do the thing that otherwise you would feel haunted by thoughts of it. I really want that. What am I missing on CNN? What am I missing on Fox? What am I missing on MSNBC? All right. Again, you can become psychologically addicted to anything. So ultimately, what's the problem with drugs here? Some, as I said, might argue that addiction is a problem, and dependency and addiction should be considered social problems in and of themselves, worthy of fighting. All right. But if we're going to go that route, then we can't be hypocrites about it. Nicotine, like I said, is more addictive than heroin. It's also more addictive than cocaine. There are 15 million known alcoholics in the U.S. today, and that's just known alcoholics. People addicted to alcohol. Caffeine addiction is on the rise. Most Americans are addicted to caffeine. And if you think, I like my sodas and coffee and tea, but I'm not addicted to caffeine, try going one day without any caffeine whatsoever, and see if you get a splitting headache. If you get a splitting headache, you're addicted to caffeine. So, there's also a reason why the pharmaceutical industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They profit on addiction. Now, there are connections between drugs and crime in 3 possible ways that have been established. The first one is pharmacological, psychological consequences of taking the drugs. This is where the danger is actually in the drug itself. The drug itself is dangerous. And taking the drug makes it more likely for you to commit a criminal act. Drugs that would fit in this category. Meth would be an example of one of these types of drugs. PCP would be another example of these types of drugs, where just taking the drug makes you more likely to commit crimes, other than taking the drug itself, I mean. But the number one, because of its wide availability in American society, the number one drug that is connected to criminal activity more than any other drug in the country is alcohol. Alcohol is the number one drug that makes people more probable to commit a crime, like drunk driving, like assault, like any number of other things that happen, that can happen when people abuse alcohol. Now, that's just one of the ways that it's connected to crime, that drugs are connected to crime. And so there are, again, to reiterate, there are some drugs out there that if you take them, it is going to significantly increase the probability that you will commit a crime as a result of just taking the drug. Number 2, the way it's connected to crime, is economic or compulsive crimes. These are crimes of where someone's addicted to, say, heroin, for example, and they're trying to feed their habit. Now, according to FBI statistics, there's about 500,000 known addicts, heroin addicts, in the United States. We're not including those addicted to pharmaceutical opioids. And we find that if you take into consideration that most property crime or theft in America goes unreported, that your average heroin, a person who's addicted to heroin, will have a $100 a day habit. That's average. They'll only be free about 270 days out of the year. The rest of the days of the year are either in and out of jail for various things or hospitals. Then what we end up finding is that the amount of property crime that occurs within the United States in terms of theft and burglary is almost exactly the amount that 500,000 heroin addicts would have to steal, and going through a fence, then they get less than what's actually worth in order to feed a $100 a day heroin habit. So that would be an example of economic compulsive crimes, where people are committing economic crimes in order to feed an addictive drug habit. Then the third one is systemic crime. Now, systemic crime would be, obviously, criminal organizations. And it helps to really think of these, as I've already said, these criminal organizations as in business terms. And so, in this sense, if something is illegal, but still highly desired by a population, that doesn't mean, it doesn't matter how harsh you get on it, it doesn't matter how much you punish, it doesn't matter how many tons of the supply you end up destroying, you're still going to have it coming in. You're still, as long as there's a demand and there's money to be made off of it, there will be criminal organizations that will supply it. So, those are the three ways. 1, pharmaceutical, psychological consequences of taking the drugs. 2, economic or compulsive crimes. 3, systemic crimes. So all of this ultimately is to say the war on drugs has not been working if the point of the war on drugs was to keep Americans from taking drugs. Well, taking certain drugs. And what we actually see is that since the institution of the war on drugs, the demand is up overall, and so is supply. So let's look at some numbers. Cocaine production. From 1990 to 2007, so 17 years there, went from 774 metric tons to 994 metric tons. Most of which going up the nose of Wall Street. That was a joke. In 2007, opium production, specifically for heroin. So opium production specifically for heroin, not pharmaceutical industries, went from 990 tons in 1971. Let me say that again. 990 tons in 1971 to 4,200 tons in 1989 to 8,800 tons in 2007. So, supply and demand economics. Now, are there other ways to do this other than locking people up? Because especially if you don't break the criminal organization, or even if you do break one criminal organization, if you don't do anything on the reason why people want the drugs, then you're not going to affect the overall issue. Actually, what's going to end up happening, if you break one criminal organization, you create an opportunity for a new criminal organization, and then they have to renegotiate turf. And you know how criminal organizations negotiate turf in terms of who's going to sell on what street corner? With guns. So you end up increasing violent crimes. This is all a very precarious game or balance that we're doing here. So are there other ways to respond to this? Yeah, the British instituted their own war on drugs following the American example. And they found, much like us, that their prisons were overfilling. They there were areas in cities where you just could not go at night because the violence and the crime were so bad. The rate of HIV, because again, no needle exchanges, so the rate of HIV was increasing significantly, and people were coming out of prisons more and more violent in England and more likely to commit violent crimes. And so England finally said, enough with this, we're going to treat this as a health issue, not a criminal issue. So that's what they did. And they started these clinics that were part of the National Health Services that was started up shortly after following World War II, where healthcare is provided for all people in England. I actually myself was the beneficiary at one time when I was in London of such care. And so what did they end up doing in these clinics? Well, if you come in and you say, I want some heroin that I know is going to be safe to try it for the first time, they're not going to give it to you. They're not there to create more addicts. But what they will do is they'll do a blood test on you, and if they find that you are addicted to heroin, they will then give you a certain amount. Now, you're only going to be allowed a certain amount per week or per month, and you have to ration that out. And so what we see happens is that there are no new cases, or very few new cases, when it's done this way. Because if you know you can go to the clinic and you can get the heroin that you're addicted to, but you're only going to get a set amount, and you have to ration that, and if you give any to anyone else, then that's out of what you have to ration for yourself. You're not going to share, and people don't. Now, they also found that 50% of people who age out of addiction. So if you don't lock people up, you provide them the drug that they're addicted to, 50% will ration and will end up aging out of it on their own. 50%. For those who stay on the drugs, though, they're able to keep their homes, their jobs, their families. They're able to remain productive members of society, because oftentimes, especially when you have to ration, the negative impacts come from the illegality, unavailability, and illegality of these drugs. So, the illegality of certain drugs, because again, we pick and choose which drugs we make illegal, increases the number of nonviolent offenders in prison. In 2007 alone, there were 1.8 million drug arrests. Then it increases police corruption. Now, police don't make very much in this country. It can be a very stressful job, depending on where the police are located. And say that you're in a port city where drugs are being shipped in, or you're in a city where drugs are being flown in, and you oftentimes work around the airport. Say somebody who's a representative of a criminal organization comes up to you. You've got 2 kids about to have to go to college, and you're going to have to worry about that. And you got a mortgage, and car note, and credit card payments, and You're struggling to make ends meet, and then somebody comes up to you and says, "Tell you what, we'll pay you 100,000 extra a year just to do nothing, just to not look over here, to leave us alone." That's how it ends up feeding police corruption. So, we also see lost tax revenue because policing drugs cost tax money, whereas selling drugs and taxing them increases the amount of money going into the states and going into the federal budget as well. So, we also see that the problem with organized crime. A lot of organized crime is fed through prostitution and drug deals and drugs. So if you end up legitimating drugs and states don't get too greedy and charge too high of a tax for them, because most of these drugs are actually very cheap to produce. And the cost of the drugs is actually coming from the illegality and the risk. And so there's this a price hike for the amount of risk that people take on and how many hands it has to swap before it gets from the grower to the processor to the distributors and all along each step of the way. And so if you do it legally, it's actually far cheaper. But many states are actually still keeping black market prices because that's more tax revenue. And while they're having a tax windfall for doing so, they're also keeping the black market alive because, if your local dispensary is out of your particular strand that you like, but a weed guy down the corner who runs a shady business, and you can get it for the same price the state's selling it for, then people do. Or even cheaper. So at this point then the states are competing with the black market in some cases. And there should be no competition. The black market should not be able to compete with states. The states should be able to offer these things very cheaply. Take tobacco, for instance. So a pack of cigarettes is, about $6, right? That's about an ounce of tobacco. Whereas an ounce of cannabis, even if you're buying in states where it's legal, it's going to cost you close to $400. Whereas there's not necessarily any other risks or difficulties in growing marijuana than tobacco. Actually, in some ways, growing marijuana is cheaper in terms of overhead than growing tobacco is. So there's no reason why states shouldn't be selling an ounce of cannabis for like $6. Anyway. We see the continuing illegality of drugs, like I said, continuing organized crime through funding organized crime. It increases property crime, as I said, with addicts, people who are addicted to certain drugs, stealing to feed their habits. And there's an inability to regulate. The government cannot regulate quality or provide quality control or safety guidelines for the production of these drugs when the drugs are illegal. And for people who say, "Oh, I want to keep drugs out of my kids' hands. I don't care what adults do, but I want to keep drugs out of kids' hands." Well, like I already said, the reason why it's easier for kids in many cities to get their hands on heroin than alcohol is because alcohol is legal and you got to be 21 or older to buy it. And the person who's got a liquor license is going to make damn sure they check your ID so that their liquor license doesn't get revoked. Alright, so if you want to keep it out of kids' hands, legalization is the way to go. Now, what does work to reduce crime and reduce the crime rate? To be completely honest, most federally funded programs aimed at reducing the crime rate do not work. One glaring example of that is DARE. DARE is such a waste of money. And the research on DARE is mixed at best. And by mixed, I don't mean like there's some evidence to suggest it keeps kids off drugs. I mean mixed in the sense that there's some evidence that it has no effect, and then there's some evidence that it actually encourages kids to try drugs. So DARE clearly is a failure, but DARE constantly gets refunded, even though the research has been out for decades now that it's a failure, that it doesn't work. Now, some programs, though, do work. And so they all have 4 things in common. Those that do work. Now, if a program has these 4 things, then it will most likely reduce the crime rate in the communities that they are instituted in. All right. So here they are. Number 1, preventing child abuse and neglect. Number 2, enhancing children's intellectual and social development so they end up being able to have more opportunities later in life. Number 3, providing support and guidance to vulnerable adolescents. And by support and guidance, we don't mean, checking in on the weekends with the kids. We mean like being a part of their life, going and making sure somebody's there for school events, things like that. Making sure it's a bond that develops where the children actually trust the adults involved. Number 4, working extensively with juvenile offenders. Do not assume just because a kid has committed a crime in their childhood that they're a lost cause. And they can become perfectly well-adjusted, productive members of society as long as we are willing to work with them intensively and not just cast them aside. Now, what's an example of a program that does work? Head Start. Head Start hits all 4 of these things. It also provides breakfast in many low-income neighborhoods to children. It provides a place where children get tutored in school. They get help in terms of interacting with other kids and developing social skills and maturing in their social skills, as well as their emotional development. And yet, while DARE is constantly getting funding, Head Start is always a fight to fund. And Head Start is one program we know actually works to reduce the crime rate. It's almost like some lawmakers want to keep locking people up in prison at high levels. So, let's put all of this into context. Let's sum up. Since the 1980s, the gap between the rich and the poor has increased significantly. People are put into prison at a higher rate than ever before, and you get forced labor out of that. Prisons are increasingly privatized, being run by profit by corporations. Oh, and by the way, the money that they're getting is still coming from your tax dollars. It's still the state paying these corporations to run these prisons. We know ways to decrease crime. First, don't be so quick to send people to prison, but that cuts into profits. 2, legalize drugs, but that cuts into the profits of alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and pharmaceutical companies. And you say, well, I can see alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical, but why firearms? Remember what I said about turf wars between criminal organizations? Even if even if a gun is illegal at one point, it was bought legally. It might be illegal once you file the serial number off of it and it's traded multiple hands, but it was bought at some point legally. Number 3, increase funding to programs that we know decrease crime and increase life chances, and cut funding to programs that don't, such as Head Start. But then that'll decrease the number of people who are being funneled into prisons if we do that, which then, as we saw with the others, cuts into profits. So ultimately, the conclusion that's drawn is we do not decrease crime because we do not want to as a society, because it would decrease the amount of wealth being generated by economic elites. So, a few things. The theory that they want to propose. You've probably heard of a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is when you commit all of your resources to winning one instance, one battle, one argument, but you end up losing the bigger picture. So it's a reference to a warlord lived thousands of years ago, Pyrrhus. I think he was fighting the Persians at the time. He was a Greek warlord, and the Persian Empire was coming through. And he committed all of his military forces to a single battle, and he beat the Persians in that battle. But then the Persians came back with more forces, and he had nothing to fight with, and so he was quickly overrun. So that's where the term comes from, a Pyrrhic victory, is you've committed all your resources to that one battle, and as a result, you lose the war. So what the authors of this book are proposing is what they call a Pyrrhic defeat theory. They're saying that we're investing all of these resources into supposedly fighting crime, but not only are we losing out on the resources, and not only are we losing the war, we're losing the battle too. Now, they draw heavily from more advanced theories than what we're really going to get into in an intro class, but they draw heavily from post-structuralism. And one of the leading founding voices in post-structuralism was Michel Foucault. And Foucault was heavily influential to the social sciences in general. He kind of had his fingers in a lot of pies, and a lot of times his insights and observations altered fundamentally how we understood and saw certain things. For instance, he introduces the concept of the panopticon. Now, all of this is in terms of social control, but they mean social control in a more malicious kind of way. Now, the panopticon is Greek. It literally means all-seeing eyes. So, those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, you look at Sauron's eye at the top of the tower, that big red eye that can see everything. That is literally a panopticon. That's what that is. It's an all-seeing eye. Now, panopticons also come from prison architecture. It was actually proposed by the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He meant it to be a more humane way to house people who have been accused of committing crimes. So he imagined a circular wall with the cells oriented around the wall of the prison, with a guard tower in the center, where the guards can see into every cell, but the people in the cells can't see if there are guards in the tower or not, so they don't know if they're being watched or not. What this ends up leading to is what Foucault terms individuation, where you take people who are otherwise in a group, where groups have power, right? And you break them up into individuals who are relatively powerless. So what ends up happening, if you might be watched at any point in time, but you don't know when you're being watched, well, what you do is you internalize whatever the institution that you're operating in, their rules, their policies, and they become a way of self-defining. Think of it almost in terms of labeling theory. Labeling theory is based on similar processes, at least psychologically. So Foucault calls this normalization, forcing people to adopt an identity that is normalized according to the standards of an institution. Now, this can only occur through individuation. This creates then what Foucault calls docile bodies. Now, the word docile is interesting. We typically mean it to mean someone who's passive, submissive, but there's an older meaning that we don't typically use anymore because language evolves and changes with time. But Foucault is kind of trying to bring that old meaning back, and the old meaning was willing to be taught. So if you were living in the 1700s and were described as a docile student, that would actually be seen as a compliment. It means that you are willing to learn, and you listen to your teachers. But in this sense, Foucault is talking about willing to learn a new identity, willing to think degradation ceremonies when you enter into a total institution, right, that we were talking about before. So, in this sense, Foucault argues that this kind of thinking and this way of social organization doesn't just stay in the penal system. It spreads out throughout all institutions in modern societies. And you say, well, how's that the case? Well, let's think about it like this. All right, so I'm making these lectures right now for a university. Most universities and colleges end up having students who are unhappy with how financial aid is doled out and how it works. You get these emails or messages saying you forgot to initial on paragraph 8, subsection 3C, line 4, and therefore you've been dropped from all your classes and you've got to come in and redo all the paperwork to get your student loan refund, etc., etc. The students can probably come up with better examples than I can, since I rarely deal with that side of the equation of things. But imagine a school with 16,000 students, and all 16,000 come together as a group, and they say, okay, we want to change policy on financial aid. And they descend on wherever the financial aid offices are housed. And you've got people chaining themselves to the office doors and saying, we demand change now. Now, what do you imagine would happen after the police were called to try to do crowd control, right? So you'll probably have representatives of the institution saying, now everyone, we cannot discuss all of your situations together. We need you to line up in a nice orderly fashion, and this will probably, we're going to go as quickly as possible, but it's going to take time because this is a lot of people, right? But we will look at each of your situations and your cases as it pertains to you. What just happened? You just were individuated. And then you wait in line, right, like a good docile body, and you finally get to the office, and you sit down in the office, and they typically don't even ask for your name first.